I was asked to provide a visual overview, and I took that very literally. Here you can see an aerial shot of Foley Square, and this is actually a good shot to start with. Towards the upper right, where you can see City Hall Park, that green triangle there, and it's a lot greener than it was 100 years ago. In the late 19th century, it was cluttered with a lot of government buildings that have since been removed, and part of this story is going to be the migration of buildings from City Hall Park to Foley Square. Now, as you can see here, Foley Square, like most squares in New York City, it's not a geometric square, it's not even a rectangle. It's bounded on the east by Center Street, on the west by Lafayette Street, the south by Reed Street, and on the north by Worth Street. And some of you probably are here for a history of Foley Square, but I think most of you are probably here because you were fans of the 1980s situation comedy, Foley Square. It followed the hijinks of a couple of young prosecutors. They were in the Manhattan DA's office, so it probably should have been called Hogan Place. You're a very select group. The show only lasted 14 episodes. But I think that's as true as today as it was back then. One good laugh does deserve another. Now, a threshold question is probably, why Foley Square? Who was Foley? Well, Thomas F. Foley was a Tammany Hall politician. He got his start as a saloon keeper, but he wasn't the most prominent Tammany Hall speaker. He wasn't Boss Croker or Boss Murphy, and yet the courthouse square is called Foley Square, not Croker Square or Murphy Square. Why is that? Well, this headline here of his obituary gives the clue. As many years before he died, he had taken under his wing a Lower East Side street urchin named Alfred E. Smith, who later went on to become governor of the state of New York and run for president in 1928. And Smith never forgot his debt to Foley for giving him his start in life. And I think that's what had a lot to do with the Board of Aldermen in 1926, a year after Foley died, deciding to name this new courthouse square for Thomas F. Foley. Just turning to the natural history of the area, as you can see here, the area that now where Foley Square now was once a sweetwater pond called Collect Pond. The lower branch there is where Foley Square was, and it was this wonderful clear water pond throughout, maybe till the mid-18th century, at which point a lot of industries, tanneries built up around it and actually polluted it to the extent that the decision was made to fill it in. And in the early 19th century, this area here just became landfill. But the area a few blocks to the east, in the decades following the filling in of Collect Pond, was the site where millions of poor immigrants gravitated. It was called 5 Points, and the reason for that is 5 streets that formed this point here and formed five points. And that's not the shadow of poverty overlooking 5 Points. That's actually my shoulder as I was taking the picture. So this area was a notorious slum for much of the 19th century. It was a destination location. People wanted to see how the other half lived. And Charles Dickens, for example, when he came to New York City, made a point of visiting the 5 Points area. But how did this slum become the site of the Civic Center in New York, where all the courthouses are located? Well, that story is really a story of how government buildings migrated from City Hall Park to Foley Square. And to tell that story, you have to go back even beyond the creation of City Hall Park to the first City Hall in New York City, which is this building right here, the Stadthaus, which was built in the mid-17th century. Renovated a former tavern, and this was the first city hall. It functioned under the Dutch period, and then from 1664 onwards under the English period till about 1700. This was the first city hall. The next city hall throughout the 18th century, the old city hall, was right at the corner of Nassau Street and Broad Street and Wall Street. You get a better sense of where it is right here. This building is still standing. Built as a custom house, then functioned as a sub-treasury. Now it's called Federal Hall, because for that little over a year when New York City was the capital of the United States, it functioned as the home of Congress and the executive branch. This is George Washington was sworn in on the steps, and when the federal government decamped for Philadelphia in 1790, it went back to being Old City Hall. But finally, in 1812, City Hall, the City Hall we know, was built in City Hall Park. And you can see the original design. It was surrounded by this lovely triangular park, Broadway on one side, Park Row on the other, and Chambers Street at the north end. You get a sense of just how rustic it was. But unfortunately, as the century wore on, it was a cheap source of land for the city on which to build buildings, and many government buildings encroached upon this original design of City Hall Park. Here's one of them right here to the left, this Brownstone Courthouse. That's right at the corner of Center Street and Chambers Street, the northeast corner of City Hall Park. You can get a better sense here of where it was when you see the Surrogates Court, then the Hall of Records rising in the background. And here's another shot of it. Maybe the most famous courthouse that was built in City Hall Park was the Tweed Courthouse. I could spend 20 minutes talking about that, but now I'm just going to talk about how it was situated at the very north end of City Hall Park, behind City Hall. And I'm going to come back to the federal courthouses and how they made their way to Foley Square. But for now, I'm just going to talk about this building for a moment. This was built as a post office and courthouse at the southern tip of City Hall Park, and unfortunately, the back of it was the loading dock for the post office. So here you can see a street plan, and this is City Hall Park, and they even mapped a street, Mail Street, where the mail was loaded onto trucks in the back of the post office. So when you think of dignitaries being greeted on the steps of City Hall, what did they see? They saw the loading dock for the post office at the southern tip of the park. Now, there were a lot of other buildings that were built in City Hall Park. Here is a building called the Rotunda that was on the north edge between Tweed Hall and the Brownstone Courthouse. It was built as an art gallery, and then it's functioned briefly as a courthouse. Here's another building that was on Park Row. It was originally the old Martyrs Jail, but it became the Hall of Records by the second half of the 19th century. So here you can see the layout of City Hall Park. You can see various buildings that aren't there anymore. And at this point, Foley Square still has not been built. You can see there's a street angling off the northeast end called City Hall Place that would be demolished with the construction of City Hall Park. Here's another view, and here you can sort of situate things a little bit better, because by this point, the Municipal Building has been built in the upper right, and the Hall of Records, the Surrogates Court is there too. But what was this area north of City Hall like? This shot shows all the clutter in City Hall Park, all these buildings that were once there that are not there. And if you look in the background, you can see the area that would become Foley Square. The first government building that began to turn things around was the Surrogates Court, which was originally the Hall of Records. And John Ritter can speak a lot more about that than I can. But it was one of the first buildings built north of City Hall Park, government buildings. It was an outgrowth of the City Beautiful movement that had its origins in the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. Here's another shot of it. The Municipal Building, of course, built in the early years of the 20th century. Again, you could go on and on about all the different plans there were to demolish City Hall, and I think John actually has some slides on that, and I won't go into that. But this is about the movement of courthouses, and the first thought was that the Tweed Courthouse, which was the New York County Courthouse, was inadequate, and what to do about it. Well, the first thought was to raise it and build a larger courthouse on the same site, and you can see that in this diagram here, where they show what its footprint would be and what it would look like a side view. That was the original thought. That was abandoned finally in favor of relocating the New York County Courthouse north of City Hall Park. So, and then actually the thought for a while was to take every government building out of City Hall Park and restore it to its original design. And this postcard, as you can see, it says proposed Civic Center, but the only building left is City Hall in the center there. The Federal Post Office and Courthouse at the southern tip is gone. Tweed Courthouse behind City Hall is gone. And this was the thought. Ultimately, thankfully, they didn't tear down the Tweed Courthouse, but the decision did go forward to build a courthouse north of City Hall Park. So in 1903, the state legislature created a courthouse board to approve the design and building of a new courthouse. And then in 1912, the Board of Estimate and Apportionment adopted a resolution selecting the area north of Chambers and east of Center and Lafayette Streets as the site for the new county courthouse. And Charles Starks will talk a lot about George McEnany's role in that. Here's another shot of the area. This domed building to the right, that was the Pulitzer's New York World building. And it is significant, actually, that this was once the center for a lot of newspaper publishing in New York, and the fact that there were a lot of printers who got off work at 2 a.m. That's going to factor into one of the buildings that we're going to find on Foley Square. So here you can sort of see the area. This is what was the 5 Points area. This is looking up Center Street, just a lot of nondescript commercial buildings by this point in the very early 20th century. Here you can see they're beginning construction. This is where Lafayette Street meets Center Street. Here's a view looking downtown, and you can see the Hall of Records. You can sort of situate this picture in time because the Woolworth Building, which I think was completed in 1912, is nearly completed then. And here's a sketch of what was originally planned, and it didn't quite come out that way. You see a new county courthouse, actually a post office that was meant to be built that was never built, and a very long square that never happened. But what were the plans for the new courthouse? Well, the city had an architectural design competition, and it was won by a Boston architect named Guy Lowell, who designed originally a very large circular building, 700 feet in diameter, that would have been so large that it would have obstructed some of the streets we have now. As you can see from this map here, it would have extended above Worth Street and it would have extended below Pearl Street. But with the onset of World War I, with cost overruns, the plan was scaled back to the hexagonal building we know now. And here you can see it going up. You can see sort of to the center there the outlines of the hexagonal building we know. What is the park in the center of City Hall. The buildings are still there. They have not been demolished yet. But finally, in 1927, the New York County Courthouse was built. It was the first government building on Foley Square. Here's its famous rotunda with its WPA murals. And within 10 years, there were a few other government buildings on Foley Square. Here you can see the county courthouse at 60 Center. You can see the New York State Office Building at 80 Center, which is now the Lefkowitz Building, named for a long-serving former New York Attorney General. And all the way to the left is the New York City Department of Health Building, which was built in the late 1930s. To get a better sense of how that relates to the current built environment, here you can see the same view, but with the criminal courts rising in the background. And that actually raises an interesting issue, because with the construction of Foley Square, it bridged a gap between all of the government buildings in City Hall Park and a number of government buildings that were above Worth Street, particularly the old Tombs and the old criminal courts. This is the original Tombs building here, which is so named because its original design resembled that of an Egyptian tomb, it was thought. And it was connected by what was referred to as the Bridge of Sighs to the old criminal courts building. This is the site of 111 Center Street, where the civil court is now. And here you can see these two buildings, their demolition being prepared, and a vacant construction site across the street where 100 Center Street, the current criminal courts, would be built. Here you see the demolition of the old Tombs. So let's turn now to the federal courts and how the federal courts ended up in Foley Square. Well, the first federal courthouse, and it's actually the first place that any U.S. federal court met, was at the very tip of Broad Street, a building called the Merchants Exchange, originally the Royal Exchange Building, and that's where the District Court for the District of New York, all of New York was just one judicial district back then, and also the U.S. Supreme Court met in 1789. The Supreme Court met there for 2 years, a year and a half roughly, didn't do much, and the Supreme Court left when the capital was relocated to Philadelphia in 1790. The U.S. District Court, of course, remained, and it moved into the old City Hall, that building at the corner of a Wall and Broad Street right here. Now, finally, in 1812, it moved into City Hall Park, and that's City Hall, which, of course, is still standing. And the courthouse, the federal courts were there for about 30 years, sharing space with every municipal branch of government. Eventually, they were crowded out, and they moved to a building on the site of the Tweed Courthouse, the old almshouse, and then they moved again to a mansion west of Broadway, the John Cox Stevens Mansion, and then finally to a renovated theater. And this might strike you as sort of strange when we consider the majesty of the federal courthouses now, that it should have had this nomadic existence and one tenancy after another. But you have to remember that in the 19th century, federal jurisdiction was not what it was today. There were admiralty cases and things like that, but you didn't have the high-profile securities fraud cases and things like that. And the federal courts just weren't as prominent as they became in the 20th century. And that's what accounts for this series of not that distinguished homes for the Southern District. Then finally, the building I showed you earlier was built at the southern tip of City Hall Park. This is the U.S. Post Office and Courthouse, completed in around 1875. The lower floors were the post office. The upper floors were the courthouses. And I show it here, and I think it's interesting to see it in relation to the Woolworth building. It was very cramped for the federal judiciary there, and the U.S. government eventually rented space in the Woolworth building for chambers for some of the judges. And in fact, the one person who is thought by many to be the greatest federal judge never to have been appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court, Learned Hand, had his chambers in the Woolworth building. And I think of poor Judge Hand shuttling across Broadway, dodging traffic to make his way from his chambers to his courtroom. It was not a satisfactory situation. So finally, in the late 1920s, the decision was made to build a federal courthouse on Foley Square. Up until this time, virtually all the federal courthouses were hybrid buildings that were a combination post offices and courthouses. This courthouse that went up at 40 Center Street was the first courthouse-only federal courthouse. It was designed by Cass Gilbert, who had also designed the Woolworth building, the Custom House, and also the U.S. Supreme Court in D.C. And a lot of very famous events happened here, which hopefully Judge Jacobs will tell us about, the Rosenbergs, the Alger Hiss trial. And this building was the federal court, the only federal court on Foley Square for approximately nearly 60 years. Things got crowded, and in 1974 or thereabouts, the U.S. Attorney's Office moved out and bought some space on a square called St. Andrew's Plaza, and the U.S. Attorney's Office has been there since 1974. The plaza was so named for St. Andrew's Church, which was built in 1939, just off Foley Square. And this congregation had been in the area for a long time. They finally got a substantial building in 1939, but because you had all these printers getting off work at 2 o'clock in the morning, what, of course, would they want to do? They'd want to go to Mass. And there was this tradition of these printers' masses at 2:30 in the morning, and they were conducted, at least in the early years, in St. Andrew's Church. I don't know if they still are. So here you see a map that shows Foley Square pretty much as it was from the late 1930s to the early 1970s. Say a word about the New York City Department of Health building, which is at the northern end of Foley Square, built in the late 1930s. You can see that little conical top to a building. That's the Tombs, and it's significant that this site was so close to the Tombs because one of the most prominent, notorious, scurrilous law firms, Howe and Hummel, had their office on this site at 89 Center Street. But that building was torn down for the construction of 125 Worth Street, the New York City Department of Health building. Rounding out Foley Square in the 1970s, you had the Family Court on Lafayette Street, which replaced two buildings on Park Avenue South and 22nd Street, a children's court and a domestic relations court building, both built, one built in around 1920, the other in the 1930s. These buildings were built not downtown. They were built to be near a lot of the charitable organizations that serve children. The buildings are still standing, but they're now part of Baruch College. The U.S. Customs Court was built, part of it in the late 60s, an expansion in the 1970s, and of course at 500 Pearl Street, the current courthouse, which we'll hear more about. In the center of the square, the park has been renamed Thomas Paine Park, and there's a statue in the statue in the center of the park is The Triumph of the Human Spirit by sculptor Lorenzo Pace. And I'll leave you with this iconic image of 40 Center Street and 60 Center Street, because I'll never forget the thrill I experienced the first time I was sent down to Foley Square as a first-year associate. I was entrusted with answering a calendar call to hand up a stipulation of adjournment, and if you're curious, I absolutely nailed it. But you know, that thrill has remained, and this image was so significant to me that I used it for the cover of my book, which I will show you only subliminally because I don't want to lower the tone of this program. And I think I'll leave it at that with this iconic image of Foley Square. Thank you.